Please subscribe to help you and your motorcycle perform better.
One of the major tasks you need to undertake over the winter is that you need to really carefully examine the steering head and the steering head bearings. It's really important that those get a thorough examination. The front end takes a lot of duress on the brakes, so knowing that your bearings are set, greased, and work correctly is absolutely critical. So how do you go about this task? Well, it's actually fairly simple and straightforward. You have to make sure the garage is hot enough so the grease is not solid goo. And that's really important, and people don't even think of that consideration. You'll have to have the bike on a rear stand, and then you'll also have to somehow prop the front end up in the air without using any kind of front stand. So what does that mean? In practical terms, you need wood blocks under the exhaust or engine. You might need stands under the engine cases. You may also use stands that reach up to and as tall as the frame slider and hold the bike up in the air that way. Lastly, of course, there is the infamous way of removing your gas tank and running straps from the ceiling down, over, and through and around the frame. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to do this, but ideally you want to do this job in one hit, start to finish, and if you're lucky and nothing needs replacing, it can be done very quickly. So, what's the quick way? Well, go ahead, loosen the triple clamp bolts and remove the steering stem nut. If you have a top mount steering damper, rotary or linear, you're going to have to remove that first before you do the triple clamp bolts. You also need to check for any plates that go between the handlebar and the upper triple clamp and remove them. You will also have to remove any other mounting screws that are in that place. Think of a clutch cable guide and a brake reservoir. Your ignition can stay in place unless you've unplugged it from the harness. If you have, then you're going to remove the upper triple clamp and set it onto the bench. If the ignition switch is still attached to the harness, put rags inside the console and lay the triple clamp over to one side, making sure it doesn't scratch anything. That will expose the steering stem. You will see an upper lock ring, either a tabbed washer or a rubber ring, and then a lower ring. And in some instances you may find initially there's a washer that has long legs on it that sits perfectly between the upper and lower lock ring. So look at it, take the first part off. That might be the washer, it might be the upper lock ring. Set that off to one side, and you're going to have to lay this all out in sequence. If you have a rubber O-ring next, remove that. If there's a washer that has steel tabs on it, you're going to have to find them and bend those steel tabs flat. Once you've done that, then you can remove the upper lock ring and then the washer. At this point, you need to put something under the front wheel that holds it in place, and the front wheel should be somewhere in the region of 12 inches off the ground. It doesn't have to be blocks of wood, it can be anything that will support the front wheel. If you don't have anything, you're going to have to grab a hold of the lower triple clamp and work with two hands. When you loosen the lower ring, you're going to essentially let the steering stem drop through the triple clamp. That's why you need the blocks, or you need a strong hand or an assistant holding the triple clamp up. Remove that lock ring and then you'll remove the dust cover. That will expose the upper bearing. Now, remove the blocks you have under the front wheel and slowly let that drop down until it hits the ground. That will loosen up the upper bearing, and that can be removed and set on the bench. You should have enough room between the steering stem and the race to clean all that out carefully. Similarly, you should have enough room at the base of the steering head of the frame to reach in and clear the lower race out with a rag so that you can then inspect the bearing. Look for any missing chrome, any disfiguration at all visually on the chrome surface. If that's all good, run your finger around it. As you run your finger around the top and bottom race, does it feel smooth? Are there any imperfections? An over-tight or loose steering head bearing will pound into that race. Yeah, it's steel, but over enough time it will dent the race. So, what's the easiest way of thinking about that? Think about a West Indian steel drum. That's dented in certain areas on the drum surface to provide a tone. Well, in this instance, if it's dented, the bearing will go over a high spot and lock into a low spot. So you'll have unpredictable steering. The bike will steer itself. If you feel those in the races, those have to be removed and replaced. So with your race bike, you need to know, can I put in steel roller bearings, which is a significant upgrade over stock? If you can, buy them from World Bearing or Timken, or get the stock races and install those. To get the races installed, you're going to need some special tools. If you can't do it at that point because the bike's completely disassembled, you need to get somebody in with tools who can. Also, you're going to have to order the stock bearings or aftermarket bearings with races, and you're going to have to make sure that those are all ready and on hand when the person comes round to install the bearings and races. Okay, if all is good, you then need to clean the top and bottom bearing. You can wipe those clean. You can get in there with some WD-40 or parts cleaner, but it's going to make a massive mess, especially on the lower bearing. So make sure everything has rags all over it, especially if you're using a pressurized cleaner to blow the bearing out. Once that's all done, blow both bearings out with a fine air tip nozzle to make sure anything and everything has been removed. Now comes the fun part. If you have a bearing filler full of grease, drop the bearing in, pack it, and away you go. For the lower bearing, you're going to have to pack it by hand manually, and that's a lot of work. You don't want to pack it so it's actually just grease laying on top of the bearing. You have to get in there and push it in between the bushings, the fitments on the races, etc. So you're going to have to pack it. You want a little excess so that when you put the lower triple clamp in and seat it, you can see where the excess grease is. So, seat the lower bearing. It will push out all the excess grease onto the dust seal. Wipe almost all of that up. It's okay to leave a little bit, but not much. So, with the lower bearing packed, go ahead and locate it into the lower race. The upper bearing should be packed. Go ahead and put that back in place. Put the dust seal over the top. Get your upper lock ring and screw that all the way down until it's hand tight. Now you should be able to let go of the lower triple clamp. There shouldn't be any clunking around. If there is, push again on the lower triple. If you get any more thread exposed, keep going until it's finger tight and snug. At this point, you want to set the front wheel ever so slightly off center, and then momentum and physics will let that wheel drop to one side or the other. You don't want it to accelerate. What you want it to do is have a fall rate side to side that is smooth but relatively linear. So if you find it's accelerating, add a tiny amount of tension with a C-spanner to that lower lock ring. Bringing the fork and wheel back to the middle, set it off center again, and watch the rate of fall side to side. Gradually add, and I mean gradually add, a tiny turn, no more than an eighth, onto that lower lock ring. When you see that the rate of fall is actually starting to slow up, it's not linear, you need to go back to the previous setting, and that will give you a good starting point. Now you can reassemble everything back together. That means the O-ring or tab washer, the upper lock ring, then fix the tabs into place so everything is locked tight, but you cannot move that lower lock ring. It must stay in exactly the position it's in. Once that's done, go ahead and reassemble the upper triple clamp, all the fittings, tighten up the upper triple clamp bolts and steering stem nut to the torque specs in the manual, and then if you have handlebars on top, go ahead and put those on and make sure they are in an even position on the upper triple. What do you do next? Well, you go ahead and lower the bike, put it down on the ground. If you're using straps on the roof, I wouldn't put the tank back on yet. Grab hold of the front rotors. I know you're going, what? Grab hold of the front rotors and see how much free play there is in the buttons. If they're very sloppy side to side and backwards and forwards, this next test is going to be difficult. You're going to hold the bike upright, hold the front brake on, and rock the bike forwards, and then pull up on it, looking for a clunk in the steering stem and the bearing. Now, if your brake rotor buttons are worn, you may get very misled at this point. So you may have to skip that and then go ride the bike. In riding the bike at about 50 miles an hour and applying the brakes firmly but not aggressively, if the bearings are still loose, you will feel a clunk forward, because at that speed, warm buttons on the rotors won't be a factor. If you feel a clunk, then off comes the upper triple again. You add a tiny amount of tension to that lower lock ring of maybe 1/8 of a turn and do it again. It's tedious, it takes a lot of time, but when it's done right, it really makes a difference under braking. And just because you did it once at the start of the season doesn't mean it's going to be fine for the entire year. At least another once or twice in the season, you're going to check those head bearings again, especially if you have a big, powerful bike and land power wheelies quite a bit. That's going to make a difference.
Dave Moss can tune your suspension no matter where you are on the planet via his remote tuning service. Contact Dave on Facebook or by email, dave@davemosstuning.com.